It was just a family portrait. When experts zoomed in, they discovered a dark secret. Dr. Jennifer Hayes had been working as a curator at the Atlanta History Center for 12 years when a donated collection arrived in September 2017 that would challenge everything she thought she understood about the post-Civil War South. The collection came from the estate of Eleanor Whitmore, a woman who had died at age 93 in Savannah, Georgia. Her descendants, clearing out the family home before selling it, had found boxes of photographs, letters, and documents in the attic, some dating back to the 1850s, and decided to donate them to the museum rather than throw away what might be historically significant. Jennifer loved this part of her job, opening boxes that had been sealed for decades, never knowing what stories might emerge from yellowed photographs and faded ink. She worked methodically, wearing white cotton gloves, carefully removing each item and documenting it in the museum's database. There were daguerreotypes from the 1850s, cartes de visite from the 1860s, cabinet cards from the 1870s and beyond. The Whitmore family had been wealthy. That much was clear. It was on her third day of cataloging when Jennifer found the photograph that would consume the next 18 months of her life. It was a large format portrait, approximately 10 by 12 inches, mounted on thick cardboard backing with an embossed border. The photograph showed a family of 5 arranged in the formal style typical of 1870s studio photography. The image was remarkably clear, well preserved despite being nearly 150 years old. At the center sat a man in his early 50s, distinguished looking with graying hair and a full beard, wearing an expensive dark suit with a watch chain visible across his vest. His hand rested on the shoulder of a woman standing beside him, his wife presumably, who appeared to be in her mid-40s, dressed in an elaborate silk gown. 3 children completed the family group. A young man of perhaps 20 stood to his father's left, and 2 girls, probably in their early teens, sat on cushioned stools in front of their parents. Jennifer turned the photograph over. On the back, in elegant script, someone had written, "The Whitmore family, Savannah, Georgia, May 18th, 1873. Below that, Thomas, Catherine, Robert, Anne, and Margaret. The studio stamp read, Morrison and Sons Photography, 122 Broughton Street, Savannah. Jennifer returned to examining the front of the image. It was only then, looking more carefully at the composition, that she noticed something she had initially overlooked. In the background of the photograph, partially obscured by the studio's painted backdrop and standing in the shadows to the right side of the frame, was another figure, a young black girl, perhaps 16 years old, wearing a simple dark dress. She stood very still, her hands clasped in front of her body, her face turned slightly toward the camera, but her expression difficult to read in the shadow. Jennifer felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She had seen this before in other photographs from this era. Black servants included in family portraits, positioned in the background, their presence documented, but their humanity diminished. Except this photograph was from 1873, 8 years after the 13th Amendment had abolished slavery. Jennifer reached for her magnifying glass. Something about the girl's posture bothered her. The way she stood, the position of her hands. She needed to look closer. Jennifer spent the rest of that afternoon examining the photograph under different lighting conditions and magnifications. She used the museum's high-resolution scanner to create a digital image that she could manipulate and enhance on her computer. As the file loaded on her screen, she zoomed in on different sections of the photograph, examining every detail. The Whitmore family members were crisp and clear in the image. Their expensive clothing showed fine details, the texture of the fabric, the intricate lace on Catherine Whitmore's dress, the pattern of Thomas Whitmore's waistcoat. The children's faces showed the typical solemnity of formal portraits, but there was also something else in their expressions. A certain confidence that came from knowing their place in the world was secure and elevated. Jennifer zoomed in on the background figure. The girl's face became clearer as Jennifer adjusted the contrast and brightness. She appeared to be around 16, with delicate features and large, expressive eyes that stared directly at the camera. Unlike the Whitmore family's formal composure, there was something haunting in the girl's expression, a mixture of fear, resignation, and something else Jennifer couldn't quite identify. Then Jennifer zoomed in on the girl's hands, clasped in front of her dark dress. At first, they appeared to be simply folded in a posture of submission or respect, the way servants were often instructed to stand in formal photographs. But as Jennifer enhanced the image further, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. The girl's fingers weren't simply clasped. They were positioned in a very specific way. Her right index and middle fingers were extended slightly, crossed over each other, while the other fingers were curled. It was subtle, almost imperceptible unless you were looking directly at it. But once Jennifer saw it, she couldn't unsee it. It was a signal, a deliberate gesture, a silent plea for help hidden in plain sight. Jennifer had studied 19th century photography extensively. She knew that subjects had to hold absolutely still during long exposure times. Any movement would create blur. This girl had held this specific hand position for the entire exposure, ensuring it would be captured in the photograph. This wasn't accidental. This was intentional. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She pulled up her research files on coded signals and gestures used by enslaved people and those in captivity. There were documented cases of people using subtle signs to communicate distress or ask for help. signals that wouldn't be noticed by their captors but might be recognized by others who knew what to look for. She compared the hand position in the photograph to historical examples. While she couldn't find an exact match, the deliberate nature of the gesture was undeniable. This girl was trying to communicate something. She was asking for help. But help from whom? The photograph was taken in 1873, 8 years after slavery had been abolished. If this girl was being held against her will, and Jennifer's instincts told her that was exactly what was happening, then the Whitmore family was committing a serious crime. They were holding someone in illegal bondage, in direct violation of the 13th Amendment. Jennifer needed to find out who this girl was. She needed to understand what had happened to her. And she needed to know if anyone had seen this silent plea for help. And if so, whether anyone had responded. Jennifer knew she needed help with this investigation. She reached out to Dr. Marcus Williams, a colleague at Emory University who specialized in Reconstruction-era African-American history. When Marcus arrived at the History Center 2 days later, Jennifer had already begun organizing what little information she had. "Look at this," she said, pulling up the enhanced digital image on her computer screen. "This photograph is from 1873, the Whitmore family of Savannah, wealthy, respected, and this girl in the background." Marcus leaned in, studying the image carefully. Jennifer zoomed in on the girl's hands. "See that hand position? That's not random. That's deliberate." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said softly, "She's signaling for help. That's what I think too. But Marcus, this is 1873. Slavery was abolished in 1865. If she's being held against her will, then it's illegal enslavement," Marcus finished, "which means the Whitmore family was committing a federal crime. And it means this girl was incredibly brave to risk sending this signal. If they had noticed what she was doing, he didn't need to finish the sentence." Jennifer nodded grimly. "I need to find out who she was." The back of the photograph only lists the family members: Thomas, Catherine, Robert, Anne, and Margaret. No mention of anyone else, like she didn't even exist as far as they were concerned. Over the following weeks, Jennifer and Marcus dove into research. They started with census records. The 1870 census listed the Whitmore household in Savannah: Thomas Whitmore, age 49, cotton merchant; Catherine Whitmore, age 42; Robert Whitmore, age 17; Anne Whitmore, age 13; Margaret Whitmore, age 11. The household also listed 2 servants: Mary Johnson, Negro, age 45, domestic servant, and Clara, Negro, age 14, domestic servant. No last name given for Clara. Just Clara, as if she were property, not a person with a full legal identity. Jennifer felt a chill. This could be her. The girl in the photograph would have been about 16 in 1873. If Clara was 14 in 1870, she would be 16 in 1873. They searched for more records. City directories for Savannah in the 1870s listed the Whitmore family at a prestigious address on Bull Street. Property records showed Thomas Whitmore owned several buildings in the commercial district and a large plantation outside the city. He was one of Savannah's wealthiest men, having rebuilt his fortune after the Civil War through cotton trading and real estate investments, but there was no record of any wages paid to servants, no employment contracts, nothing that would indicate Clara, if this was indeed Clara, was a free worker receiving compensation for her labor. Marcus found something else. Newspaper articles about Thomas Whitmore from the Savannah Morning News. He was frequently mentioned in society pages, praised for his business acumen, his civic contributions, his standing in the community. In an 1872 article about prominent Savannah families, the reporter wrote, "Mr. Whitmore maintains his household in the finest Southern tradition, and with well-trained servants who know their place and perform their duties with the efficiency one expects from proper management." "Proper management," Jennifer repeated, her voice tight with anger. "Well-trained servants who know their place." This is 1872, 7 years after abolition, and he's being praised for running his household like a plantation. Marcus was reading another article. "Jennifer, listen to this. It's from 1874, a year after that photograph was taken. A letter to the editor complaining about uppity freedmen who were demanding wages and leaving their former master's employment. The letter writer says, 'Some families have maintained the old arrangements, where loyal servants remain in their positions, grateful for the security and guidance of benevolent masters.' This was code. Old arrangements meant slavery. Loyal servants meant people being held against their will. They were uncovering a dark truth. Illegal enslavement hadn't ended with the 13th Amendment. In parts of the South, particularly in rural areas and in households of the wealthy and powerful, people continued to hold black workers, especially children, in conditions of slavery, hiding it behind the language of domestic service and employment. And Clara, standing in the background of a family portrait, had tried to tell the world what was happening to her. Finding concrete information about Clara proved difficult. Unlike the Whitmore family, whose lives were extensively documented in newspapers, property records, and social registers, Clara existed only in fragments. A first name in a census record, an unnamed figure in a photograph, a ghost in the archive. Jennifer and Marcus expanded their search. They looked through records from the Freedmen's Bureau, the federal agency established after the Civil War to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. The Savannah office had kept detailed records of complaints, contracts, and cases. After days of searching through boxes of fragile documents, Marcus found something. It was a complaint filed in August 1873, just 3 months after the photograph was taken. The complainant was listed as Clara, Negro girl, approximately 16 years, residing at Whitmore Residence, Bull Street. The complaint stated, girl reports being held without wages, not permitted to leave household, threatened with violence if she attempts to depart. Requests bureau intervention. Jennifer felt her hands trembling as she read the document. She tried to get help. She filed a formal complaint. What happened? Marcus turned to the next page. It was a report from the bureau agent who had investigated. Visited Whitmore residence on August 24, 1873. Mr. Thomas Whitmore states that Clara is employed as domestic servant, receives room and board as compensation, is free to leave at any time but chooses to remain. Clara was not made available for interview. Mr. Whitmore states she was visiting relatives in the countryside. Given Mr. Whitmore's standing in the community and lack of evidence to contrary, case closed. They didn't even interview her, Jennifer said, her voice filled with disbelief and anger. They took Whitmore's word for it. Because he was wealthy and white and respected, his word was enough. They closed the case without ever speaking to Clara. But the complaint told them something crucial. Clara had tried to escape. She had found the courage to reach out to the one federal agency that might help her. The photograph had been taken in May. The complaint was filed in August. Something had happened in those 3 months that had given Clara hope, had convinced her to risk asking for help. Marcus found more documents. There were records of other complaints filed against prominent Savannah families in the early 1870s. Black workers, mostly women and children, reporting that they were being held without pay, forbidden to leave, subjected to violence. Many of these complaints were dismissed or closed without investigation. The Freedmen's Bureau was underfunded, understaffed, and facing enormous pressure from white Southern power structures to not interfere with domestic arrangements. Jennifer searched for what happened after the complaint was dismissed. She found a brief mention in the Freedmen's Bureau records from September 1873. Clara, Whitmore household, subject no longer at residence. Mr. Whitmore states she departed of her own will. No forwarding information. Case permanently closed. Clara had disappeared. Whether she had escaped, been sold to another household, been sent away, or met a worse fate, the records didn't say. She had vanished from the archive as completely as if she had never existed, but Jennifer refused to give up. Clara had left that signal in the photograph. She had filed that complaint. She had fought for her freedom. Jennifer owed it to her memory to find out what had happened. She began searching through other sources. Church records, cemetery records, hospital admissions, court cases, anywhere Clara's name might appear. Marcus searched through records from black communities in Savannah, looking for any mention of a young woman named Clara who might have escaped from illegal enslavement. Then, in a collection of letters held by the Savannah Public Library, Jennifer found something. The letters were from a woman named Harriet Monroe, a black teacher who had run a school for freedmen's children in Savannah in the 1870s. In a letter dated November 1873, Harriet wrote to a colleague in Charleston, "A girl came to me last week, having escaped from a household where she was held in slavery despite the law. She is 16 and has known nothing but bondage her entire life. She cannot read or write. She has nowhere to go and no family. I have taken her in and will teach her. Her name is Clara. She is frightened but determined to build a free life." Jennifer felt tears streaming down her face as she read the words. Clara had escaped. She had found her way to someone who could help her. She had survived. To understand what Clara had endured, Jennifer and Marcus needed to understand the Whitmore family more deeply. They began researching Thomas Whitmore's background and discovered a history that explained everything. Thomas Whitmore had been born in 1824 into a wealthy plantation family. His father had owned over 200 enslaved people on a rice plantation outside Savannah. Thomas had grown up in a world where slavery was not just an economic system, but a complete social order, where white supremacy was treated as natural law, where the humanity of black people was denied as a matter of course. When the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, Thomas lost his inherited labor force. His father's plantation, without enslaved workers, became economically unviable. But Thomas was clever and adaptable. He moved to Savannah, invested in cotton trading and real estate, and rebuilt his wealth. But he never accepted that the old order was truly gone. Jennifer found evidence of this in his correspondence, preserved in the family papers donated by Eleanor Whitmore's descendants. In an 1866 letter to his brother, Thomas wrote, "The Yankees have declared the Negroes free, but freedom is meaningless without resources or education. Many will return to their former masters, grateful for the security we provide. We must simply adapt our methods while preserving the essential arrangements that made our civilization great." Essential arrangements, Marcus said bitterly. He meant slavery. He was already planning how to continue it under a different name. They found more letters revealing Thomas's strategy. He would hire former enslaved people, often children or young women with no family, offering them room and board instead of wages. Once they entered his household, he would control every aspect of their lives, preventing them from leaving, threatening them with violence or legal consequences if they tried to escape. Legally, they were employees. In reality, they were enslaved. And he wasn't alone. Jennifer and Marcus found evidence of a network of wealthy Savannah families who practiced similar arrangements, sharing information about which workers were reliable, meaning too frightened or traumatized to resist, warning each other when federal agents were investigating, helping each other retrieve servants who attempted to escape. Catherine Whitmore, Thomas's wife, was complicit in this system. Letters from her to relatives described how she managed the household servants, emphasizing the importance of strict discipline and constant supervision. In one chilling letter from 1872, she wrote, "The young colored girl we acquired last year has proven satisfactory after proper correction. She now understands what is expected and performs her duties without complaint." Acquired, Jennifer repeated, like she was property, like they bought her. They researched what proper correction would have meant. It meant beatings, deprivation of food, being locked in rooms, psychological torture through threats and humiliation. It meant living every moment in fear, never knowing when violence would come, having no control over your own body or life. The Whitmore children had grown up watching this, learning from their parents that this was normal and acceptable. Robert, the eldest son, would inherit his father's business and his father's values. The two daughters, Anne and Margaret, were being trained to manage households the same way their mother did. This was the family Clara had been trapped with. This was the household she had tried to escape, and the photograph captured all of it. The Whitmore family in their finery, proud and confident, and Clara in the background, invisible to them but desperately signaling to anyone who might see. Jennifer looked at the photograph again with this new knowledge. Thomas Whitmore's hand on his wife's shoulder wasn't just affectionate, it was possessive. Catherine Whitmore's jewelry and expensive dress weren't just fashion, they were displays of wealth built on exploitation. The children's serious expressions weren't just photographic convention, they were the faces of people being taught that some human beings were less than others. And Clara, standing in the shadows, had defied all of them by leaving that signal in the photograph. Jennifer became curious about Morrison and Sons photography, the studio where the photograph had been taken. What had the photographer thought when Thomas Whitmore brought his family and Clara for this portrait? Had he noticed Clara's hand signal? Had he understood what it meant? She researched the studio and found that it had been operated by James Morrison and his two sons, Edward and William. The Morrisons were Scottish immigrants who had established their photography business in Savannah in 1868. Unlike many Savannah businesses, they advertised that they served both white and black clients, unusual for the era and a source of some controversy. In the archives of the Savannah Morning News, Jennifer found an editorial from 1871 criticizing the Morrison studio for forgetting the natural order by photographing black families alongside white clients. James Morrison had responded with his own letter to the editor. "My studio serves all who can pay the fee regardless of race. Photography is a democratic art. The camera sees only light and shadow, not color or class. Every person deserves to have their image preserved." This was a photographer who saw black people as fully human, who believed they deserved the same dignity and documentation as white people. This was someone who might have noticed Clara's signal. Jennifer searched for any surviving records from the Morrison studio. Most photography studios from this era kept detailed ledger books recording each client, the type of photograph, the price paid, and sometimes notes about special requests or circumstances. If the Morrison studio records still existed, they might contain information about the Whitmore family portrait. After weeks of dead ends, Marcus found a lead. The Georgia Historical Society in Savannah had acquired a small collection of materials from the Morrison studio in the 1950s. Most of it was routine business records, but there was also a personal diary kept by Edward Morrison, one of the sons. Jennifer and Marcus drove to Savannah to examine the diary. It was a slim, leather-bound volume, its pages brittle with age. Edward had made entries sporadically, mostly noting significant events or interesting clients. Jennifer turned pages carefully, searching for May 1873, and there it was, an entry dated May 18th, 1873. The Whitmore family came for a formal portrait today. Wealthy cotton merchant, very particular about the arrangement and lighting, insisted on including the colored girl who works in their household, positioned in the background. The girl was frightened, barely spoke. When I positioned her for the photograph, I noticed her hands. She was holding them in an odd way, fingers crossed. I asked if she was comfortable, if she needed to adjust her position. Mr. Whitmore answered for her, said she was fine, told her not to move. I took the photograph, but I am troubled. The girl's eyes, there was such fear in them, and her hands. Was she trying to signal something? I have heard stories of freedmen being held in conditions of slavery, particularly young people with no family to protect them. I wanted to speak to her privately, but Mr. Whitmore never left her side. I pray I am wrong about what I suspect, but if I am right, then I have documented a crime and I do not know what to do about it. Jennifer felt a wave of emotion reading those words. Edward Morrison had seen. He had understood. He had recognized Clara's signal for what it was, but he hadn't known how to help her, and his photograph, meant to document a prosperous family, had instead become evidence of their crime. She turned the page. There was another entry, dated August 30th, 1873. I have been thinking about the Whitmore photograph for months. The girl's face haunts me. Today I went to the Freedmen's Bureau office and spoke with an agent. I told him about the photograph, about the girl's obvious distress, about my suspicions. He thanked me and said he would investigate. I do not know if he will. I do not know if anyone will help her, but I have tried. I have at least tried. He reported it, Marcus said quietly. Edward Morrison saw Clara's signal, understood it, and tried to help her. Jennifer checked the dates. The Freedmen's Bureau complaint filed by Clara was dated August 1873, the same month Edward Morrison had gone to the Bureau. Had his report given Clara hope? Had knowing that someone outside the Whitmore household had seen her distress given her the courage to file her own complaint? The timing suggested a connection. Clara had somehow learned that the photographer had reported what he'd seen. Perhaps the Bureau agent had mentioned it when investigating. Perhaps word had gotten back to her through the network of black domestic workers, who found ways to communicate despite their isolation. However she learned about it, it had given her hope. It had given her the courage to speak up herself. And when the Bureau had failed her, when the agent had closed the case without even interviewing her, she had found the strength to escape on her own. Jennifer and Marcus returned to Atlanta with copies of Edward Morrison's diary entries and a renewed determination to find out more about Clara's escape. The letter from Harriet Monroe had confirmed that Clara reached freedom, but they wanted to know the details. How had she gotten away from the Whitmore household? What had given her the courage and opportunity to run? They began researching Harriet Monroe, the teacher who had taken Clara in. Harriet had been born free in Charleston, South Carolina in 1841. She had learned to read and write despite laws prohibiting the education of black people. After the Civil War, she had dedicated her life to educating freedmen, opening schools wherever she could find space and students. In Savannah, Harriet had operated a small school out of a church basement, teaching children during the day and adults in the evening. Her correspondence, preserved in several archives, revealed a woman of extraordinary courage and compassion. She regularly sheltered people fleeing from situations of abuse or illegal bondage, helping them find work, teaching them to read, connecting them with family members they'd been separated from during slavery. In her letters from late 1873 and early 1874, Harriet mentioned Clara several times. Jennifer pieced together the story from these fragments. Clara had escaped from the Whitmore household in September 1873, just after the Freedmen's Bureau had closed her case. She had waited until the family attended church on a Sunday morning, then had slipped out of the house with nothing but the clothes she wore. She had remembered the location of Harriet's school. Perhaps she had heard about it from other black workers, or perhaps she had seen it during one of the rare moments when the Whitmores allowed her outside the house. She had walked through Savannah's streets in broad daylight, terrified that someone would recognize her and return her to the Whitmores, but determined to reach the one place she knew might offer help. Harriet described their first meeting in a letter to a friend. She arrived at my door on a Sunday afternoon, breathless and shaking. She could barely speak at first. When she finally told me her story, I felt such rage at what had been done to this child. She had been held in that household since she was 9 years old. 9 years old. She had been beaten, starved, worked from before dawn until late at night, never paid a cent, never allowed to leave. She didn't know if she had any family living. She had never learned to read. She had been treated as property, as a thing, not as a human being with rights and dignity. Harriet had hidden Clara in her own home, knowing that Thomas Whitmore might try to retrieve her. Under the law, Clara was free. The 13th Amendment was clear. But Harriet knew that law and practice were different things, especially when powerful white men were involved. She kept Clara out of sight for several weeks, teaching her to read and write, helping her regain some sense of her own worth and capability. In October 1873, Harriet wrote, "Clara is beginning to heal, though the scars run deep. She still flinches when I raise my hand suddenly. She eats as if she expects the food to be taken away. She has nightmares every night, but she is learning. She is so bright, so eager to read. She devours every book I give her. She is discovering that she has a mind, that she has value beyond her labor. It is beautiful to witness, though heartbreaking to know what was stolen from her." Jennifer found evidence that Thomas Whitmore had indeed looked for Clara. He had posted a notice in the Savannah Morning News in September 1873. "Runaway. Negro girl named Clara, age about 16, dark complexion, medium height, departed from my household without permission. Reward offered for information leading to her return." He had disguised his illegal enslavement as a simple case of a servant leaving employment, but the reward suggested his desperation to get her back, probably to prevent her from talking about what had happened in his household. But Clara never went back. Harriet protected her, and the black community in Savannah closed ranks around them. When investigators came asking questions, no one had seen Clara. No one knew where she was. The network of freedmen protected one of their own. By December 1873, the Whitmores seemed to have given up searching. Clara remained with Harriet, learning and growing stronger. And in the spring of 1874, Harriet helped Clara do something extraordinary. In April 1874, nearly a year after the photograph was taken, Clara did something that would change the trajectory of her life. With Harriet's encouragement and support, she wrote a testimony about her experience. She had learned to write only months before, but she was determined to document what had happened to her. Jennifer found this testimony in the archives of the American Missionary Association, an organization that supported schools and churches serving freedmen. Harriet had sent Clara's testimony to them, hoping it would help expose the reality of continued illegal enslavement in the South. The document was written in careful, slightly unsteady handwriting, the writing of someone newly literate, but the words were powerful and clear. Clara wrote, "My name is Clara. I do not know my family name. I was born in slavery in 1857 on a plantation outside Savannah. I was taken from my mother when I was 6 years old and sold to a family in the city. When the war ended and we were supposed to be free, I was 9 years old. The family I lived with told me nothing had changed, that I still belonged to them, that if I tried to leave, they would have me arrested or killed. I believed them because I was a child and knew nothing else." She described being sold again in 1868 to the Whitmore family. She was 11 years old. Mrs. Whitmore said I would work in the house. She said if I worked hard and obeyed, I would be treated well. But there was no wages, no freedom. I worked from before sunrise until late at night, cooking, cleaning, washing, serving. If I made a mistake, I was beaten. If I was too slow, I was locked in the cellar without food. They told me this was how things were, that this was my place, that I should be grateful they gave me a roof and food. Clara wrote about the isolation, how she never spoke to anyone outside the Whitmore household, how she began to believe she would die in that house without ever experiencing freedom. Then, in May 1873, something changed. They took me to a photography studio. It was the first time I had been outside the house in months. The photographer was kind. He asked if I was comfortable. I was not allowed to answer. But in that moment, I thought maybe someone outside that house might see me, might understand. I made a signal with my hands, a prayer, a plea. I did not think it would matter, but it did. Somehow, the photographer understood. He reported what he had seen, and when I learned that someone had tried to help me, I found the courage to try to help myself. She described filing the complaint with the Freedmen's Bureau, her hope when the agent said he would investigate, her despair when nothing changed. I realized then that no one would save me. I would have to save myself. So I planned. I waited. And when the opportunity came, I ran. I ran to the only place I knew might be safe. And Miss Harriet took me in. She taught me to read. She taught me that I am a person, not a thing. She taught me that freedom is not just about not being enslaved. It is about having dignity, having choice, having a future. Clara's testimony ended with a powerful statement. I'm writing this so people will know that slavery did not end with the war. There are others like me, still trapped in houses across the South, still being held against their will, still being denied the freedom that is supposed to be our right. My freedom came because one person, the photographer, saw me and tried to help, and because another person, Miss Harriet, gave me shelter and taught me. But there are so many others. If you are reading this, please understand, slavery is not gone. It just wears a different face now, and we need help. Jennifer sat in the archive reading room, tears streaming down her face as she read Clara's words. This testimony, written by a 16-year-old girl who had just learned to write, was one of the most powerful historical documents she had ever encountered. It was proof, direct, personal proof, that the 13th Amendment had not ended slavery, that illegal bondage continued for years after the war, that children like Clara were still being held in conditions indistinguishable from slavery. And it all connected back to that photograph, Clara's signal, Edward Morrison's observation, Clara's courage to escape, Harriet's compassion, a chain of events that had led to freedom and to this testimony that would survive 144 years to bear witness to the truth. Jennifer and Marcus continued researching, wanting to know what happened to everyone involved in Clara's story. What became of Clara after 1874? What happened to the Whitmore family? Did anyone face consequences for holding Clara in illegal bondage? The answer to the last question was disappointing but not surprising. No, the Whitmores faced no consequences. Despite Clara's testimony, despite Edward Morrison's report, despite the evidence of their crime, Thomas Whitmore was never investigated or charged. He was too wealthy, too well connected, too protected by a system that was already beginning to roll back the gains of Reconstruction. By the mid-1870s, federal support for Reconstruction was waning. The Freedmen's Bureau was defunded and disbanded. Northern politicians lost interest in enforcing civil rights in the South. White supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan used violence and intimidation to restore the old racial order. The brief window of possibility that had opened after the Civil War was closing. Thomas Whitmore continued his business, died peacefully in 1891, and was buried with honors in Savannah's prestigious Laurel Grove Cemetery. His obituary praised him as a pillar of the community, a successful businessman, a devoted family man. There was no mention of Clara or any of the other people he had held in illegal bondage. Catherine Whitmore outlived her husband by 15 years, dying in 1906. The children grew up to become respected members of Savannah society. Robert took over his father's business. Anne and Margaret married well. The family's wealth and status continued for generations. But Clara's story was different. Jennifer found traces of her life in the years after her testimony. In 1876, Clara was listed in the census as a teacher at Harriet Monroe's school, living in Harriet's household. She was learning, growing, building a life. In 1879, Harriet wrote to a colleague, "Clara has become an excellent teacher. The children love her. She is patient and kind, but also firm. She teaches them not just reading and arithmetic, but about their rights, about their worth. She tells them her story so they will know how to recognize injustice and fight against it. She has transformed her pain into purpose. In 1882, Clara appeared in Savannah City Records as the operator of her own school. At age 25, she had established an independent educational institution for black children funded by the American Missionary Association and by the black community in Savannah. She was no longer a victim. She was a leader, an educator, a voice for justice. Jennifer found a newspaper article from 1885 in a black-owned newspaper, the Savannah Tribune. It featured an interview with Clara, now 28, about her work. Miss Clara, as she is known to her students, runs a school that serves 50 children. She teaches them reading, writing, arithmetic, and history, including the true history of slavery and the ongoing struggle for equality. I want them to know their past, she says, so they can build a better future. I want them to understand that freedom is something we must fight for every day. The article included a detail that made Jennifer's heart swell. Clara had kept the photograph. Somehow she had obtained a copy of the Whitmore family portrait. Perhaps Edward Morrison had given her one. Perhaps she had commissioned her own print from the negative. The article mentioned that she showed the photograph to her students, pointing to herself in the background, explaining how she had signaled for help, teaching them about resistance and survival. Clara had turned the photograph meant to document the Whitmore family's prestige into a teaching tool about injustice and resistance. She had reclaimed her own image and used it to educate the next generation. Jennifer found Clara's name in records through the 1890s and into the early 1900s. She married in 1888 to a man named James Porter, a carpenter and community activist. They had 3 children. Clara continued teaching until 1903, when illness forced her to retire. She died in 1905 at age 48, too young. But she had lived as a free woman, had built a life of purpose and dignity, had raised children in freedom, had educated hundreds of young people. Her obituary in the Savannah Tribune called her a beacon of courage and an inspiration to all who knew her story. In March 2019, Jennifer and Marcus prepared to share their findings with the public. The Atlanta History Center agreed to host an exhibition centered on the photograph and Clara's story. Jennifer wrote the exhibition text, choosing her words carefully, wanting to honor Clara's courage while also exposing the truth about the Whitmore family and the continuation of slavery after its legal abolition. The exhibition opened with the photograph displayed large on the wall, with a detailed explanation of what viewers were seeing. Jennifer had created an annotated version of the image, with arrows pointing to Clara's hands and an enlarged detail showing the signal clearly. The text explained, "This young woman, Clara, was being held in illegal bondage in 1873, 8 years after slavery was abolished. The hand signal she makes in this photograph is a silent plea for help, captured forever in an image that was meant to celebrate the Whitmore family's prosperity." The exhibition included Edward Morrison's diary entries, Clara's testimony, Harriet Monroe's letters, census records, newspaper articles, everything that documented Clara's story. It included context about the failure of Reconstruction, the continuation of illegal slavery, the courage of people who resisted and those who helped them. But the most powerful element was Clara's own voice. Jennifer had Clara's testimony reproduced in full, displayed on the wall in letters large enough to read from across the room. Visitors stood reading Clara's words, many of them crying, all of them moved by the directness and power of her story. The exhibition attracted national attention. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the photograph and Clara's signal. Historians praised the research. Educators requested permission to use the materials in their classrooms. The photograph went viral on social media, with millions of people seeing Clara's face and learning her story. But the most meaningful response came from Clara's descendants. A woman named Michelle Porter contacted the museum after seeing news coverage of the exhibition. Michelle was Clara's great-great-granddaughter. The family had preserved stories about Clara. They knew she had been enslaved as a child even after abolition, that she had escaped, that she had become a teacher. But they had never seen the photograph. When Michelle came to the museum and stood before the image of her ancestor, she wept. "She's so young," Michelle said. "So scared, but so brave. Look at her. She's standing there in that horrible situation, and she's fighting back the only way she can. She's asking for help, and eventually she got it, and she survived. And because she survived, I'm here." Jennifer showed Michelle all the research materials, including Clara's testimony. Michelle read it slowly, her fingers tracing the words her ancestor had written 145 years earlier. "This should be required reading," she said. "Everyone should know this story. Everyone should understand that slavery didn't just end one day because of a law. It continued. People fought to keep it going, and people like Clara fought to be free." The exhibition led to broader conversations about the legacy of slavery, about how its effects continued long after legal abolition, about how understanding this history is crucial to understanding present racial inequality. Universities invited Jennifer to speak. Documentary filmmakers contacted her about creating a film about Clara's story. But for Jennifer, the most important outcome was simpler. Clara's story was known. The photograph that the Whitmore family had commissioned to document their wealth and status had become instead a document of their crime and of Clara's resistance. The signal Clara had made with her hands, the desperate plea that might so easily have been overlooked, had finally been seen and understood. Jennifer often stood in the exhibition, watching visitors examine the photograph. She saw them lean in close, looking at Clara's hands. She saw recognition dawn on their faces as they understood what they were seeing. She saw them move to read Clara's testimony. And she saw them leave, changed, carrying Clara's story with them. The photograph that had seemed like just a normal family portrait had revealed its dark secret. And in revealing that secret, it had become something Clara herself had wanted it to be. Evidence, testimony, and inspiration. A reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, people resist. Even when freedom seems impossible, people fight for it. And sometimes, if we look closely enough, if we pay attention to the signals people send, we can see the truth that others tried to hide. Clara's signal had waited 144 years to be truly seen and understood. But now it was. And now, finally, her story was told.